On the phone, we have a gentleman who played at the University of Notre Dame. He also had a very successful NFL career. He won a national championship at Notre Dame, George Kunz. How are you doing today, Mr. Kunz?
David, I'm doing fine, thank you.
How did you end up going to Notre Dame? Did Coach Parsegian recruit you?
Well, I was raised in the Los Angeles area. My high school was 3 miles from USC, but before I started playing college ball. I was in the seminary for 2 years, and part of the reason that I wanted to go to Notre Dame was because if there was a chance for a vocation, I wanted to give that the opportunity to grow. As it turned out, I slammed into puberty, and the idea of getting a vocation and being a priest went by the boards. But the getting a good education and a religious education in many ways was important to me. So those were some of the reasons. The other reasons were that Notre Dame was on the rise. They had a great program. It was good scholastically. And there were a lot of good schools that recruited me, but they were good scholastically. It was a right fit because it had a combination of everything I was looking for.
Notre Dame wasn't co-ed back then, right?
That's correct. It was a all-male institution. We did have St. Mary's right across the road, and that was sort of interesting. We had because we didn't have any girls in our classes, and then for the first 3 years, and then senior year, the St. Mary's ladies had a chance to take courses at Notre Dame. So I think in the second semester of my senior year, I actually walked into a class and it was half filled with women, and that threw me. I wasn't used to that because I went to an all-male high school. Was in the seminary before I went to the high school, and then for 3 years at Notre Dame, it was an all-male institution. So you really had to sort of clean up your act a little bit and to look more presentable when you went to class.
My grandmother said Notre Dame only made one mistake in all its time being an institution is when they admitted women.
Well, you know what? I think it's more or less the quality of the individual, not necessarily the sex of the individual that matters. But it was great. We had a lot of good ladies in class, and I think they benefited from being in a class with some guys to get a different attitude too.
I went to an all-male high school, Catholic too, and everybody laughed when I went to college. They said, "Why do you surround yourself with girls?" I said, "Listen, I haven't been around a girl in 4 years. I want to sit next to them. I don't want to sit next to guys anymore."
Exactly. Well, it's interesting because my mother was very. I was raised by my mom, and she was very adamant about getting an education in Catholic schools all the way through, and she really did everything she could to make sure that happened. And we didn't have a lot of money, but she wanted to make sure that was part of the educational process, and it sort of carried over. But yeah, it's different because in that age, in the 50s and 60s, you had a lot of institutions. The Catholic schools were more or less most of them were all male or all female. And when they combined the two, and it made sense because it cut a lot of costs. But when they did that, I think it gave the kids a chance to get more exposure to the real world before they got out into it.
Exactly. What was it like that 1966 season with Notre Dame?
Well, we had great leadership. Just Jim Lynch, Kevin Hardy, Terry Hanratty, Jim Seymour, Nick Eddy. There were so many guys that we looked up to. And if you're a sophomore, I had the privilege of starting the first 2 games when I blew out my knee in the second game against Northwestern. And a guy that I think you've interviewed, Bob Kuchenberg, came in and replaced me for the rest of the season. So Bob was a sophomore also. But being a part of that and seeing what it took to be a leader was really helpful for the rest of my career to see what these guys acted like. And it wasn't talk. A guy like Jim Lynch didn't have to talk. A guy like Jim Lynch acted, and you saw how he acted and how he responded to challenges. And that really had a lot to do with setting a leadership tone for a lot of guys who were there. And if you're going to take a look at individuals like that, we had so many leaders on that team that it wasn't hard at all to find out what you had to do and how to do it right.
Kuchenberg insisted Alan Page wasn't that great of a player at Notre Dame, that he became the great player in the NFL.
Well, Alan, I think he had some issues. There were times when, obviously, I don't think we all didn't feel like practicing some days. But I think Alan needed to be spurred a little bit at times, and John Ray was there to spur him. But I'll tell you what, when you talk about raw talent and the ability to get up for a game, and when a challenge came around, and life is a series of challenges, and a game is a challenge. But Alan always met that challenge when called upon. And I learned in the pros, and not necessarily at Notre Dame, I learned at the pros it was important you be ready by game day. At Notre Dame, you were ready every day. That was the difference in going to school there and getting ready for a game in the pros.
What was Coach Parsegian like?
The most organized guy I've ever met as a head coach. Don't forget, Era went to Miami of Ohio. He played for Paul Brown there. That was the seat of coaches at that particular time. And I think Era took a lot of pages out of the Paul Brown notebook and the way he handled practice. We walked into a stadium, get ready for practice in the afternoon, and the schedule for practice was posted on the board. And it was on the board an hour and a half before the practice actually started. So you knew minute by minute what you were going to do, and he very rarely varied from that practice. When you started out, your practices at the beginning of the season, 2-a-days practice would be 2.5 hours a day, twice a day. And by the end of the season, when the season started, you'd have it down to about 2 hours. By the end of the season, you were on the field an hour 15. Because if you didn't know the system by then there was something wrong with the coaching staff. And that's what I think Eric really was taking a look at. He had a lot of confidence in his coaches. But he wanted you off the field after an hour 15, and most of that time was conditioning. You'd run your plays. You did it in a manner that conditioned you, and you didn't make mistakes. And what he felt like doing was getting it done right, getting off the field so nobody got hurt. So that later on in the season we had fewer injuries than we'd have that other teams would have, because we got what we got what we needed to get done, and got off the field quickly.
You mentioned the linebacker Lynch. I mean, Bunikani wasn't too shabby either.
Well, Nick wasn't there when I was there. I had a chance to meet Nick when he was with the Dolphins, and my guy, that was one of the quickest individuals I've ever seen. Now he wasn't really big, but Nick was extremely quick and active, and it was a pleasure playing against him. I did cuss him a few times when I missed him, but at the same point in time, he was his attribute was quickness, and he didn't have a lot of size, but that quickness carried him a long way in the pros.
What was that Michigan State game like in '66 that ended in a tie?
Oh God, just personnel. I don't know. I think it was something like 17 first-round draft choices on both sides of the ball in that game for the pros. I had to watch it because I was out for the season with a knee. But when you take a look at who was on the team and the individuals involved, I mean, it was a cast of giants. It was like if you were going to compare it to a Hollywood movie, I mean, it'd be an endless cast of superstars that made it in the NFL. And that was the way I approached the game. No matter how big, and there are always big games each year and in a decade. But when I go back and take a look at the sheer talent that was on the field in that game, that had to be a classic.
Everybody was on Era for playing for the tie, but I think he had to. I mean, you don't want to trust your kicker to basically have to make a field goal. And again, that was in essence, you had one game left against, USC, but Michigan State had they had one game left too, but I don't think you could take the chance.
Well, let's take a look at what you're talking about in terms of playing for the tie. Number one, Terry Hanratty, our starting quarterback, was there. We were going with a second-team quarterback. Nick Eddy was hurt, so we had a second-team running back in Bob Glaggio, who came in from there. And when you take a look at what's going on, Michigan State at the end of the game put Notre Dame in a position back on deep in Notre Dame's own territory, and the only way you could really win the game was to throw the ball up in the air and risk the interception. So there were a couple things that Eric considered. You've got to put this into the mix. Number one, that was Michigan State's last game of the season. No matter what happened, they couldn't prove anything else after that game for that year. Notre Dame had a game against Southern Cal, and if we had to prove a point, we could prove it next week. The week after we played Michigan State, we beat Southern Cal 51-0. We won the national championship. I would say that Era took everything into consideration. He played the cards the way he had to play them, and it proved to be successful in his strategy.
Did you feel that you should have won another national championship at Notre Dame?
I felt that we could have. I think every year we were there, we were in the top 10. Our class was. It's hard to say. When Notre Dame won the national championship, and when we won in 1966, we had a great defense. I think we had like 7 shutouts. If you look at the schedule, we had 7 shutouts, and our defense gave us the ball a lot. In 1966, if we won the toss, we elected to defend because we always put our offense in better shape because of the defense. As we progressed and into our senior year, our offense averaged 505 yards a game. So the difference was whenever we won the toss, we got the ball. So there was a difference in philosophy, and Arrow was really good at changing that philosophy to fit the personnel. The one thing, Arrow was, in every sense, a true college coach because he took a look at his personnel, and he made his offense and his defense work based on the personnel he had. He didn't bring a bunch of kids in that had to fit into his system. Arrow made the system fit the personnel. And that's the big difference in Ara Parseghian and a lot of modern coaches nowadays who go out and recruit for a specific way of doing things as opposed to getting the best kids he could and putting the situation around them. So I have a lot of respect for Ara as a coach because the first week of spring ball was all, where are you going to play this kid? And after that, the next period of spring ball was how are we going to refine this kid? And then you came back and you earned your spot on the team in the fall. And that's the way Arrow always did it, and he was successful with it.
Were you surprised when you were in the second pick in the draft after O.J. Simpson was picked first?
Well, you know, it's a difficult question. I would have to say, with all humility, I would have to say no. But the reason I would say no is that a month and a half prior to the draft, they had already flown me down to Atlanta twice. Once to meet the head coach and to talk to management. Another time to, at that particular time with Vietnam going on, they wanted to get me in the National Guard. So I had already been down there twice. So was it a surprise to me that I was drafted next to O.J.? No, because I knew a month and a half ahead of time it was going to happen. Atlanta, Norm Van Brocklin was down there, and Norm had come down from Minnesota. And they wanted to rebuild the offensive line. But secondly, they were taking a look, as Ara did. He wanted to get the best athletes. And for better or for worse, correctly or incorrectly, I was a pretty good athlete. So they looked at offensive line, they looked at athletes available, and that's what they did. So I was aware of what was going on at least 6 weeks ahead of time. So was it a surprise? No. Was it a surprise 6 weeks before that? Yeah. Because, you know, all I wanted to do, if I had a shot at playing, was to see exactly where I was going to be drafted. Because I didn't know if I was going to be drafted. I had no idea what was going on. But if I wasn't going to be drafted, I was going to go to law school. So one or the other occurred, and I knew about it. Thank God I had a little bit of lead time going into the draft.
Was Coach Van Brocklin tough to play for?
I think no. Yes and no. But as an individual, Norm could be a very gracious guy. I think there were a lot of scars on Norm from what happened to him in Minnesota. And I'm not too sure exactly what happened. So for better or for worse, Norm's interpretation was it was never going to happen to him again. And I think that, for a lot of reasons, influenced the way he approached the game. But if here's a guy that won a world championship with the Philadelphia Eagles. He was with Bob Waterfield in the L.A. Rams before that. He comes to Atlanta, and he's got the challenge of taking the team with the second worst record in the league up, and he did it his first year when our class got drafted. He did it with 17 rookies on the roster, and we went 6-8. So it was a major turnaround in Atlanta at that time. Here's a guy that, 45 years of age, adopted 3 children. He and his wife did, because he didn't want to see these orphans split up, starting his life again at 45. There are a lot of good things about Norm, but I think the scars from Minnesota really influenced the way he approached the game.
Did you play in the college all-star game in '69?
I did.
What was it like going against Joe Namath in that Jets team?
Well, I went against Jerry Philbin.
Oh, Jerry Philbin.
I didn't worry about Joe too much. That was a defensive responsibility. But Jerry Philbin was an all-pro and a great defensive end. I didn't have a bad game against him, and I was happy about that. But the best part about the college all-star game is you get a chance, at that particular time, I think I played in the East-West game, the Hula Bowl, the Coaches All-American game, and the College All-Star game. But we got to know a lot of the All-Americans and a lot of the guys that were from all around the country. We knew each other because we'd played 3 or 4 or 5 games with one another. And that was probably the best part about it. Playing against Joe, that was the first game of the season. Joe may have played a quarter or a half, but we were more intent on wanting to beat the Jets because we really felt we could. We had a pretty good class. We had Otto Graham as a head coach. He had a great staff with him, and I'll tell you what, we almost did it. But Joe was he was a hallmark when he came out there. I mean, people took a look at Joe, and he was the presence of the NFL at that particular time. My concern was Jerry Philbin. I didn't worry too much about Joe because that wasn't my job.
Did you have to practice against Joe Green during those practices going into it?
Well, no, Joe didn't. He was not under contract, so he didn't show up for the All-Star game. But he was trying to make a deal with the Steelers, and he didn't want to jeopardize injuring himself before he got that deal. But I knew Joe because we were both on the Playboy All-American team, and we were roommates. So I've known Joe since since the fall of '68, the spring of '68. He's a great guy, and we had a chance to get to know each other, and we've known each other for a long time.
Did you ever think to yourself, you know what, if someone else would have drafted me, like the Steelers or something, I would have had a chance to go to a couple Super Bowls and things like that?
Well, you can't. I had a great offensive line coach in Baltimore, Whitey Duvall, who was with the Bears for a long time, and I loved Whitey. He's an old bearded guy out of the University of Maryland, and he said something that I adhere to this day. He's a very wise man. He said, don't worry about things you can't control. So what I could control was how I approached a game, the way I practiced, the way I performed. And even performance is something that you not only rely on yourself, but you got to take into consideration the ability of the guy you're playing against. So yeah, would it have been nice to play in a World Championship game in the Super Bowl? Yeah, but you know what? It didn't happen. I had a chance to play in some playoffs. That was great. I appreciated that, and I enjoyed every minute of it. But there are very few guys, when you take a look at the total number of people in the NFL, that have that experience, and there are fewer guys even yet that have it more than once. And I applaud them for that ability, but that takes teamwork. And hopefully you're in a situation that works like that. But if you don't make it, you got to count on teamwork, and you got to take a look at the possibility of doing it, not necessarily the actuality of doing it.
Who was the toughest guy you went against?
Oh, geez, there were a couple of guys that I really respected. I went against Deacon Jones twice a year for about 4 years, and Deacon was at the top of his game. I think if I had a bad game, it would be against Deacon. The guy that I respected that you don't hear a lot about, there are a couple of guys I respected greatly. One was Rick Jackson, who played for Denver, and I don't know if people even remember Rick, but he was a great defensive end with a super outside move and had a knee problem, some kind of an infection or problem with his bone, and after a few years just sort of disappeared, retired. But I always thought he was great. Vern Den Herter from the Miami Dolphins was the kind of guy, 6'7", probably a 40-inch sleeve on his shirt. A guy like that could grab you and throw you if you weren't careful. There were a lot of guys that probably didn't get the reputation or the name because of the teams they played with and the times they played, who you could count on to give you a great game. But Deacon was probably the guy that I had the hardest day against. What made Deacon that helped Deacon become equally great was having Merlin Olsen on his inside. So that combination was deadly.
Right. I mean, he had Lamar Lundy, Roger Brown. He had some great guys around him.
Oh, yeah. Well, there were few guys, and when I talk about the Rams' left side of their defensive line, there are few defensive tackles that can, and this is an esoteric term, that could take a gap and a half. And what that meant was that if Merlin Olsen was lined up on the inside eye of a defensive or an offensive guard, he could get to the outside shoulder of that guard, which meant that he could cover territory. Now, if a defensive lineman can do that, the defensive end can work the outside harder. If that can happen, then he could come around the outside all day, and you'd have to stop that because Merlin could cover both gaps. That's what made the Rams great with those two guys on the left side at that time, was the ability of Deacon to come around the outside and the ability of Merlin Olsen to cover a gap and a half.
You had some great players in Atlanta. You, Tommy Nobis, you had Claude Humphrey. Humphrey's in the Hall of Fame. Why doesn't the Atlanta players get the respect of the Hall of Fame like other teams do?
Well, it's an interesting question. I think it may have to do with some of the sports writers that were in Atlanta at that particular time who felt that if the team couldn't win, then nobody should be in the Hall of Fame. That may be the case, but the bottom line is that we have to be successful. I think the guys that are immediately attentive to people taking a look at them to get in the Hall of Fame are the guys that played for teams with noteworthy record. The Steelers, the Cowboys, teams that have had good records. They're usually their players get in a pretty good, a lot quicker than the guys that didn't play for teams that had that reputation. But the bottom line is that it's a sports writer's job to elect the people into the Hall of Fame. And if sports writers in a certain town feel that their players don't deserve it, then they're not going to get the votes. And I don't think that's the situation in Atlanta now, but I think that was probably the situation in Atlanta at the time that we played there. And if that's the case, then I certainly understand why they wouldn't vote for him. But there's got to be a push locally to get people going, and if there isn't, then the chances are slim to none, and Slim left town.
Yeah, I feel bad for some of these older guys. I mean, now they only let one guy in this year. In the past, there was two. But Dick Stanfield was a finalist twice, didn't get in. He just passed away. Jerry Kramer, not Don Hudson, from the Packers. Their wide receiver Holland. He's not in, and he was the all-time leading receiver at the time he retired. I know he took on the NFL as the president of the association, but they got to do something about this.
Well, that's, again, I go back to Whitey's comment, you don't worry about things you can't control, and hopefully they will someday. There are a lot of guys out there that I think are deserving, but I understand the need to limit the access, and it's just a matter of how you limit it. But, the sports writers, don't get me wrong, they do a good job in terms of what they're trying to get done, but there are a lot of people that get sort of not pushed to the side, but you get overlooked simply from the fact that there's no coverage and no reason to push them and where they played. And if that's the case, then, that I certainly understand what's going on.
Right. I just like to see the guys go in when they're alive, like Billy Houghton.
Yeah. Well, that's why Mick Tinglehoff was a great center, and I'm glad Mick get in this year. I think the senior committee can put in 2 a year. I was surprised that they just put in 1 last year with it, and that was Mick. But that was a deserving individual. But, they have the ability to put in 2. I'm sure there are guys out there that deserve it, that fit the bill one way or another.
What is it with you Notre Dame guys? You all go to law school. You, Alan Page, Buonicotti, Bob Thomas, Chris Zorich.
Well, you know what? I think that guys realize that there's a life after football, and they want to do something. Notre Dame recruits the kind of kid, and I'm not blowing smoke. My hope is that everybody goes to a school they love, and because I certainly did. But they recruited a certain kind of kid, and that kind of kid was exceptional on the field, and he may not be a scholar in the classroom, but he gave it a shot. And that's basically what I think you're talking about, and the guys that ended up going to law school. It's something I've always wanted to do. When they get a chance to do it, they're going to take it, and that's just the in my mind, that's the kind of a kid that Notre Dame recruited. Guys that realized that there was life after sport, and that when you got into it, you gave it as much attention as you did when you played football. So, from that standpoint, I'm proud of the school in doing that, and I hope that standard never falls. But I think it's going to be challenged by virtue of the fact that, we're going to continually want to seek that national championship because of our history and because of the need to do it. And I think the alumni is responsible for pushing it, and I'm glad they do, because you want to see that combination of in the classroom and on the field. If we ever lose that, then we were just like everybody else.